You have cooked steak at home. You followed the recipe. You got the pan hot, you salted it, you let it rest. And when you ate it, something was off. Not bad, just not restaurant. Never restaurant. You have been eating at steakhouses your entire life, wondering what they are doing that you are not. The answer is not technique. It is not a secret spice rub. It is not the chef's hands or the professional equipment or some culinary school trick they never told you about. The real reason restaurant steak tastes better than your steak is a combination of three things your kitchen is structurally incapable of delivering. And at least one of them, the restaurant industry, has had zero incentive to explain to you. The gap is real. It is measurable. And once you understand exactly what is happening to a piece of beef between the farm and your plate at a steakhouse, every home cook you have ever spoken to about this subject will seem like they were missing the entire conversation. If you enjoy understanding how the world actually works beneath the surface, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. Drop in the comments what country you're watching from. This script draws on research from peer-reviewed food science literature and documented industry standards from institutions, including the United States Department of Agriculture and the American Meat Science Association. Now back to it. The first thing you need to understand is what beef actually is before a restaurant gets to it. Most home cooks buy their steak from a supermarket. The steak has been cut, vacuum sealed in a modified atmosphere package, shipped within 48 to 72 hours of slaughter, and placed on the shelf. It is fresh, it is legal, it is exactly what you asked for, and it is fundamentally different from what a high-end steakhouse is serving you. Here is why that matters. Immediately after an animal is slaughtered, the muscle tissue undergoes a process called rigor mortis, a chemical stiffening that makes the muscle fibers contract and lock. If you cooked beef at this stage, the texture would be like chewing a rubber band. What reverses rigor mortis is time, specifically enzymatic breakdown of the muscle proteins by the animal's own biology. This process is called aging, and it is what transforms raw beef from rigid and bland into tender and flavorful. Your supermarket steak has received a minimum of this. A top steakhouse steak has received weeks of it, sometimes more. There are two ways to age beef. The first is wet aging. The steak sits in its vacuum-sealed bag in a refrigerated environment, and its own enzymes work on the muscle structure. This is what most commercial beef goes through. It takes roughly 28 days to hit its practical ceiling, but most supermarket beef gets far less. The second method is dry aging. This is where it gets strange. Dry aging should not work. Think about what it involves. You take a large cut of beef, you hang it or place it uncovered in a temperature and humidity-controlled room with specific airflow, and you leave it there, open to the environment, for weeks, sometimes months. The outside of the beef desiccates and grows a crust of mold. You are deliberately letting meat, a highly perishable protein, sit exposed to air and microbial activity for as long as 45, 60, even 90 days. Everything your instincts about food safety tell you says this should produce something inedible, possibly dangerous. It does the opposite. Dry-aged beef at 30 days produces a concentration of flavor and a tenderness of texture that wet-aged beef at the same duration cannot match. The science behind this is documented in research, published through institutions like the American Meat Science Association, and reviewed in food chemistry literature for decades. Here is what actually happens inside a dry-aged cut. The enzymes, specifically calpains and cathepsins, which are the animal's own cellular breakdown machinery, continue disassembling the structural proteins in the muscle. Collagen breaks down, myosin breaks down. The tight fibrous lattice that gives raw muscle its chewiness gradually loosens at a molecular level. 45 days of this produces a steak that is structurally different from the animal it came from, not just older. Meanwhile, water is leaving the surface of the meat. The outside dries, the interior loses moisture content, and what you're left with is a more concentrated mass of protein and fat with a higher ratio of flavor compounds per gram than the same cut had when it was fresh. The mold on the exterior, a controlled bloom of specific species, including penicillium, produces enzymes that contribute to flavor development in the outer layers, which are then trimmed before the steak is sold. This trim loss is part of why dry-aged beef is expensive. You start with a large primal cut, and you lose a meaningful portion of its mass to moisture evaporation and trimming over the aging period. Estimates in the industry put the usable yield of a well-aged primal at roughly 60 to 70% of its starting weight. You are paying for beef that was never sold to you. Most home cooks have never dry-aged anything. The infrastructure it requires, precise temperature between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius, relative humidity between 75 and 85%, consistent airflow, and weeks of patience, is simply not available in a domestic refrigerator. A standard fridge runs too cold and too humid for proper aging. It also has fluctuating temperatures every time you open the door. Restaurants and dedicated aging facilities have purpose-built environments maintained around the clock. The steak difference starts here, before anyone has turned on a single burner. Now here's the part that most food content gets wrong about restaurant steak. People focus on searing technique, butter basting, cast iron temperatures, resting times. These all matter. But they are downstream of something far more fundamental, and that is fat architecture. Marbling is the term for intramuscular fat, the fine white threads and flecks of fat distributed through the muscle tissue itself, not in a cap around the outside, but woven through the interior. And when you apply heat to a well-marbled steak, the intramuscular fat melts from the inside of the muscle fiber structure. It bastes the muscle from within. The fat carries flavor compounds, lipid-soluble aromatic molecules produced during the Maillard reaction and through the fat's own thermal breakdown, through every bite simultaneously. A steak with high marbling does not need butter. The basting mechanism is already built in at a structural level. The United States Department of Agriculture grades beef on a scale that runs from select at the bottom through choice in the middle to prime at the top. Prime represents roughly the top 3 to 4% of all federally graded beef produced in the United States. It is graded on marbling above everything else. Your supermarket carries choice. Some carry Angus programs with enhanced marbling standards. Almost none carry prime on a regular basis, because prime is expensive and its shelf life in an open retail environment does not justify the margin. Prime goes to steakhouses, hotels, and specialty butchers. Choice goes to the consumer. This is not a conspiracy. It is basic supply chain economics. But the outcome is that the majority of home cooks have never cooked prime beef in their lives, and they are benchmarking their results against restaurants that are starting with a fundamentally superior raw material. Select to prime is not a small gap. A select sirloin and a prime ribeye are not variations of the same product. They are different expressions of the same animal, produced by completely different feeding, genetics, and grading processes. In the American system, prime grading requires a USDA inspector to physically evaluate the carcass against documented marbling standards, established by the Agricultural Marketing Service. This is a real federal standard with a real paper trail, updated and maintained by a real government agency. The grade on the sticker is not a marketing opinion. It is a documented measurement outcome. There is a parallel grading system worth knowing. Japan's Wagyu beef operates under the Japan Meat Grading Association standards and runs on a 5-point beef marbling standard scale, where 5 represents extraordinary intramuscular fat content that visually makes the muscle look more white than red. Japanese A5 Wagyu, the highest combination of yield grade and quality grade in that system, has a fat to protein ratio that is so different from standard Western beef that it actually has a lower melting point fat profile. The fat in high-grade Wagyu begins melting at temperatures close to body heat. This is documented in food science research on the unique fatty acid composition of Wagyu cattle, particularly the elevated levels of monounsaturated oleic acid in the intramuscular fat. Oleic acid is the same primary fat found in olive oil. Wagyu fat is measurably softer, more aromatic, and melts at a lower temperature than the fat in most Western beef. A 5-ounce portion of A5 Wagyu is not a bigger version of your home sirloin. It is a different product category. Now for the heat. This is where the home cook loses even if they have access to good beef. Most home stoves in the United States and Europe generate between 12,000 and 18,000 British thermal units per burner at maximum output. A commercial kitchen range operates at 35,000 to 55,000 British thermal units per burner as standard. Restaurant flat-top grills and broilers exceed this. A commercial salamander broiler, the infrared overhead heat source used in many steakhouse finishing applications, generates temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius at the element surface. Your oven broiler produces roughly 260 degrees Celsius at its maximum setting. This is not a small difference. This is a gap that changes the chemistry of what happens to the steak surface. The Maillard reaction, the browning process that produces the crust flavor compounds on a properly seared steak, requires high surface temperatures, low surface moisture, and fast application of heat. When the pan is hot enough and the surface is dry enough, the amino acids and sugars in the beef undergo a complex cascade of chemical reactions, first described in the 1910 scientific literature by Louis-Camille Maillard, a French chemist. These reactions produce hundreds of distinct flavor compounds in milliseconds. The result is the crust, not just the color, the actual flavor molecules that give a restaurant steak its seared depth. Here is what kills the Maillard reaction in a home kitchen. The moment a cold, wet steak hits a pan that is not hot enough, the surface temperature of the pan drops. Moisture from the steak's surface vaporizes and creates a steam layer between the steak and the pan. The Maillard reaction requires direct dry heat contact. The steam prevents it. Instead of crust, you get gray, steamed protein. It looks like searing. It does not taste like it. A commercial range delivers enough BTUs to maintain pan temperature through the thermal shock of a cold protein hitting it. A domestic range does not. The solution steakhouses frequently deploy for large cuts is the reverse sear method. Cook the steak at low temperature first, either in an oven or on an indirect grill, Then finish it in a scorching hot pan or under a broiler at maximum heat for the shortest time possible. The low temperature phase gets the interior to temperature without cooking the exterior. The high temperature finish creates the Maillard crust without driving further heat into the interior. But even with this method, the sealing on domestic equipment is still below commercial capability. There is a third variable that almost no one discusses, butter. Not the fact that restaurants use butter, that is widely known, but how much and when. The practice of a roser, systematically basting a steak with repeatedly spooned hot butter and aromatics during cooking, does two things simultaneously. It bastes the upper surface with fat that carries flavor compounds from the garlic, thyme, and other aromatics in the pan, and it transfers heat to the upper surface while the lower surface is in contact with the pan, cooking the steak from both directions at once. The fat vehicles the flavor, the technique accelerates even cooking, and the volume of butter used, easily 3 to 4 tablespoons per single steak in a professional preparation, is something most home cooks would consider excessive before they began. Professional kitchens also use compound butters, pre-made mixtures of butter with bone marrow, herbs, anchovies, or roasted garlic that are placed on the steak during its rest period and melt into the surface as it sits. The fat carries aromatic compounds into the surface meat as it relaxes. The rest period itself, allowing the steak to sit after cooking so the muscle fibers relax and reabsorb internal juices, is often done at a slightly elevated ambient temperature in a restaurant kitchen, which slows moisture loss during resting. At home, resting on a cold cutting board pulls temperature from the steak faster than the interior can redistribute its moisture effectively. Salt. One more variable, and it is not subtle. The timing of salting beef changes its outcome at a chemical level. Salt applied immediately before cooking draws moisture to the surface through osmotic pressure and creates a wet brine layer that impedes the Maillard reaction. Salt, applied 45 minutes or more before cooking, allows the osmotic process to complete. The moisture is drawn out, dissolves the salt, and then gets reabsorbed back into the meat, carrying the salt with it. The surface dries. The interior is now pre-seasoned. When that steak hits the pan, the surface is drier and the interior has absorbed its seasoning uniformly. Most steakhouses salt their beef hours before service. Some salt primary cuts at the beginning of a shift for end-of-shift use. Some salt whole primals before portioning. The timing is not incidental. It is operational planning that produces a measurably better result. The salt used also matters in a way the industry rarely advertises. Kosher salt and coarse sea salt have larger crystal structures than table salt. Larger crystals dissolve more slowly on the surface of meat, which means the osmotic draw and reabsorption cycle completes more gradually and more uniformly through the surface tissue. Table salt, with its fine iodized crystals, dissolves almost instantly and draws moisture so aggressively that the reabsorption phase is uneven. Steakhouses use coarse salt, not for aesthetics, for surface chemistry. The finishing salt applied at service, flaked sea salt from producers like Malden, a brand whose production has operated in Essex, England since 1882, is applied in large flakes that partially dissolve on the surface of the rested steak and provide bursts of salinity that vary bite to bite. This is deliberate contrast engineering, not decoration. The practical reframe is this. If you want restaurant results at home, you need to address the variables in order of impact. First, source better beef. Prime grade, or its equivalents in your country's grading system. The EU uses a Superiority grid scale. Japan uses the Japan Meat Grading Association scale. Australia uses the Meat Standards Australia system. These are real documented standards. Find a butcher who stocks the upper grades. Second, salt early. Minimum 45 minutes before cooking, ideally several hours. Third, get the pan as hot as your equipment allows and use a stainless or cast iron surface, not nonstick, which cannot reach or maintain necessary temperature safely. Fourth, finish with more butter than feels reasonable. If you are not uncomfortable with the volume of fat you're adding, you're probably using less than a restaurant. The aging gap is harder to close. Dedicated home dry aging bags with moisture permeable membranes, sold by several specialty companies, create an approximation of a dry aging environment inside a standard refrigerator and can produce measurable results over 2 to 4 weeks. They are not identical to a purpose-built aging room. They are meaningfully better than no aging at all. The bag allows moisture vapor to escape while blocking external contaminants, mimicking the directional permeability of a controlled aging chamber. You place a thick bone-in cut, a ribeye or short loin works best, inside the bag, seal it, and leave it on the lowest shelf of your refrigerator undisturbed. Check at 14 days. The surface will darken and firm. That is correct. At 21 to 28 days, the outer pellicle has developed, moisture concentration in the interior has increased, and enzyme activity has been working on the protein structure the entire time. Trim the outer layer before cooking. What you have underneath is measurably different from what you started with. Here's the fact that makes all of this heavier. The steakhouse knows exactly what it is doing. The sourcing decisions, the aging infrastructure, the equipment specifications, the butter volumes, the salt timing, none of this is accidental and none of it is hidden. It is standard operating procedure documented in every serious culinary training program and in every professional kitchen manual. The information was never secret. It was just never in the places where home cooks were looking. The culinary industry trains its professionals on all of it. It sells you the finished product and lets you believe the gap is talent. You were not failing at cooking steak. You were succeeding with ingredients and equipment never designed to produce the result you were benchmarking against. Every home cook who has ever blamed their own ability after a disappointing steak was running the wrong diagnosis. The restaurant was not better than you. It used a different starting material, different equipment, and a different operational timeline. 3 separate categories of advantage, none of them skill. You were cooking the wrong steak all along.